Every now and then, a game comes along that has such a unique approach or style that you can't help but be in awe of it. Games that don't really get compared, but get compared to, or in rare circumstances, stand even above that. The Outer Wilds, Return of the Obra Dinn, they sit in that category. Dark Souls is a game that, is now a genre unto itself. Animal Well is a recent potential example of this because it's just that good. A game that deserves to be experienced rather than talked about. Because the more you discuss, the more you risk pulling back that curtain a little bit too far. So what is the opposite of that then? Games that are so bad they're used as a litmus test for failure, like Bad Rats? Or is it instead perhaps that middle area between the two, the grey zone, where games can fall and be forgotten? One or two good aspects buried in there, sure, but ultimately they come and go with no real fanfare. This is Astor, Blade of the Monolith.
In a forgotten age, the ancients mastered secrets we cannot fathom. Today their presence has vanished, their legacy buried beneath a world engulfed in darkness. Only Astor, the young chosen one, possesses the power to defy his evil and restore their lost glory.
Let's get this out of the way up front. Astor, Blade of the Monolith is a 3 out of 5. We're going to do this backwards today. Missy Elliott style, we're going to flip it and reverse it. Astor, Blade of the Monolith has some very impressive ideas floating around, but it's like trying to jump and catch a balloon on the ceiling. Fingertips brushing against it just before you inevitably crash through the coffee table. We need some context first though, so let's go. Basics. Astor Blade of the Monolith is a single-player, fast-ish paced action RPG from C2 Game Studio. This is their first PC and console game. Their previous games have been more mobile-focused. Astor Blade of the Monolith sees you playing as the titular Astor, a young warrior Diokek who becomes the chosen one the prophecies speak of. You're tasked with a great burden, as all prophecies are wont to do. Helping you achieve this, you're giving several upgradable weapons, powers, the standard selection of accoutrements. Astor Blade of the Monolith campaign took just over 8 hours to complete, with some side quests sprinkled in there. 26 out of 41 of the available achievements as well. So if you're looking to wrap up all the side quests and achievements, you can expect over 10 hours out of this. It is recommended that you play it with a controller, but keyboard and mouse are a valid option and was my chosen method for 99% of the game. More on that 1% soon. You can rebind the controls if you need to, but apart from that, the settings mentioned in the menus are fairly standard with no options that really jump out at us as being impressive or negligent. The game. The story of Astor Blade of the Monolith holds some interesting ideas and actually reminds me of a tabletop game I played called Numenera. There was also a video game that you might be aware of as well. Numenera is a sci-fi tabletop role-playing game. It's set in an indescribably distant future. Billions of years we're talking. The book builds up this beautiful world built on those that came before. You see, you're part of the 9th world in Numenera. There were 8 previous grand generations that have come and gone, and you're the 9th. It's one of those beautiful tabletop games that gives you a great amount of information, but allows the freedom to fill in the gaps with your own fantastical ideas, finding technology from generations gone and from previous civilizations, but not knowing what they used it for, more just knowing what you use it for now. It's got a lower focus on combat than some games like Dungeons and Dragons. There's some good similarities between Astor and Numenera, that's why I mentioned it. There's unknown makers from the before, there's discussions of a world lost that's laying underneath what's current, and of course there's a towering monolith in both that holds secrets. Astor Blade of the Monolith does have threads of a decent story, and some larger themes, never getting bogged down in those. You're discussing concepts of self and identity, purpose, life, death, and more. They all kind of come up in one way or another. It's the most interesting part of the game, and it's a real shame to me that the combat and that core loop is lacking the refinement to allow the whole game to be raised up to that higher level. The core loop. I talk a lot in games about the core loop. It's one of my go-to discussion points because I think it's really important. In case you don't know what that is, in a really basic definition, it's what you're going to be doing for most of the time in the game. It's the way in which the mechanics of the game come together to keep you interacting with them through your playtime. It's not everything included in the game, it's not all of the systems and mechanics, or everything that you're going to be interacting with in the game. It's what's at the center of it, where most of your time is going to be. And depth isn't always a good thing either. It's about how enjoyable that core loop is, the level of polish applied to it. Shallow loops can be some of the most incredibly enjoyable ones. Don't mistake depth for quality. The Diablo series is an example of a shallow loop. You kill monsters to get gear, to kill bigger monsters to get better gear. Factorio, on the other hand, is, oh god no, it's pulling me in!
3:28 a.m.
Astor, Blade of the Monolith, has a fairly shallow core loop. The larger problem, though, is that the core loop is abrasive and feels needlessly, I'm going to use the word clunky. Astor describes itself as a fast-paced action RPG. That sentence can conjure the idea of certain games into your head when I say it. Fast-paced action RPG. Maybe you're thinking Devil May Cry, maybe that jumps to the front, or something like Bayonetta. There's a fluidity to the combat, a dance, combos and abilities linked together, effortlessly passing through enemies and the environment like a brushstroke from an artist. The issue with Astor is that combat doesn't feel like that. Every time you connect to an enemy with a hit, there's a pause. It's momentary. You might not have even noticed it during the footage that's playing until I've just mentioned it now. But once you do notice it, it's prominent, and it's really distracting to me. Add on to this other combat decisions, such as the sword having a weird black and white slow motion kill feature. It feels like it happens every other enemy, or some of the later weapons having rather large knockbacks on them. It just stacks up. Like, combat is enjoyable, mainly because it never gets complicated enough for these things to become a problem, but it ruins that flow. It takes something from being up at the top to being in that middle. Oh, and remember how I said that I used the controller for 1% earlier? That's because of dodge and block. Dodge on mouse and keyboard is on shift up when you release the key, not when you press it. It feels like a weird design choice. Block and parry, on the other hand, is on middle mouse as default, and it felt incredibly unresponsive at times. At times it was very quick, it parried perfectly, but there were times, especially during the final boss fight, where it just felt like it was unresponsive, to the extent that I tried swapping to a controller to see if that was any better. It wasn't. So I then just rebound it to a key and made do. So, core loop out of the way, Astor does the standard things you'd expect from a game of this type. That middle-of-the-road approach. You'll gain new weapons as you progress, each one having purchasable upgrades to lengthen the combos, add new moves, or just outright increase the damage. There's health and stamina nodes you can grab to boost those bars up. There's challenge portals scattered around to give you little snippets of combat with rewards if you want them. And there are side quests for the Diokek villagers that you're going to encounter throughout the different biomes. None of it really jumps out as being exceptional, but none of it is frustrating or egregious enough that it becomes a problem. Like I said, middle of the road, safe. There's nothing to truly dislike about Astor. The only problem is that the positives aren't as polished as they could be, and the game ends up suffering for it. Outside of the combat issues mentioned, there are smaller bugs that can range from minor things such as falling into holes in the world or getting stuck while climbing on vines, which I had happen a few times, or my personal favorite that I had happen twice, being pinned against a wall or an object by a friendly NPC and then being forced to reload your game. It's not all negative though when it comes to discussing this game. Exploring the world was enjoyable. Astor is a silent main character, sure, but has a great little design. I also love the masks in this game. I think they're cool. Learning more about the Diokek as you progress through the game does a lot of the lifting story-wise. The different masks they're wearing, where they came from, what they represent. It never bogs you down with too much really heavy philosophical talk or ideas, but they are there, and it's using what it needs to, where it needs to, when it needs to give the story depth. That pretty much sums up Astor Blade of the Monolith fairly well. A game that never gets to the high points that it could achieve, but it never sinks too low into tedium. It just floats along that surface. A safe choice. Personally, I would have liked to see it take a few more risks in certain areas, or a little more flair, especially in combat. But safe in the middle is better than sinking to the bottom, which happens to some games. Oh, and very final note, shout out to the map. All I can say about it is that of all the maps I've seen in all the games I've played, this is definitely one of them.